Welcome, and I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to be with Adam Collins today, journalist, broadcaster, communication specialist, advisor to multiple politicians, Australian, English, father of a new 5-month-old baby girl. Yo, wow, what haven't you done, Adam? You're welcome.
Thanks, Morris. It's lovely to join you.
Good. So what are you up to at the moment? Where are you?
Well, I am in my house in North London. I am in the middle of a test series that's being played, which I'm covering for a number of media organisations, but not attending, which is very unusual for me. I like to be where the action's at. It's kind of both my, I suppose, passion in sport and in journalism, but also my business model is that I'm the guy who's on the spot, on the ground, where it needs to be. I enjoy travelling and I enjoy getting the opportunity to witness things firsthand. So it was a fraction odd last week being at home on the sofa when a number of my colleagues were at the ground at Southampton for the first test match in the biosecure bubble, but I wasn't. So it's like purgatory at the moment. We've got sport back, but for me, it's not quite as I most enjoy it.
Yeah, okay. And cricket is your passion?
Yeah, to an extent. It's certainly, as far as sport's concerned, I kind of grew up in a household where sport was the proxy for everything. In the winter, I was defined by following the Hawthorn Football Club. In the summer, I was defined by playing cricket in the garden or in the front yard, or very classic quintessential Australian upbringing until the sun went down, and would do so from October till March, and then the cycle would begin again. So on the basis of that, I've always had an acute interest in footy and cricket especially. But with cricket, it just was one of those things where at the end of my stint being a political staffer, I had a couple of ideas of bits of writing I wanted to do, and one thing led to another, and I had a column. And after taking a role in another job for a window of time, I realised that I needed to be doing something creative, and writing was a great outlet for that. So I suppose I was able to tie a couple of interests together, that being writing and creative sort of thinking, and also sport and cricket. And having kind of came out of this political tradition where I worked crazy hours and lived a pretty high wire existence through my 20s, this was a nice logical next step.
And why are you in the UK?
I am in the UK. Well, that's a very good question. I don't really consider it much these days. I must say, it just kind of happened. No, I did spend a lot of time in the UK as a student, and early in my career, so in my 20s, whenever I had the opportunity to travel, I would, and invariably it would end up being back in England, where I have family links and so forth. So I came over here a little bit as a kid and was kind of fascinated by that. I was always really interested in my grandparents. I grew up with my parents, of course, and my brother, but also very closely to my grandparents. That was the first home I lived in, and even through to when my grandmother passed away in 2013, I was still very close to her. When my granddad died, I went and lived with her for a few years, and she was from North Wales, up in a town called Denbigh, right up towards Anglesey there, real up in the I guess the very corner of North Wales. And my grandfather was, he was from he lived in a lot of parts of England, but principally Bournemouth, and he'd been in the military and served in the war and so forth. So I always had a strong interest in their lives. And I think that it wasn't as though I was an obsessive, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not an Anglophile per se. It's just that it felt quite natural being over here. And when the cricket career began, it made sense to be over here for the English summers and Australia for the Australian summers, because of the professional side of things. It was good. It was convenient. I had both passports. It was easy. And over time, I just thought that, well, why don't I live in the UK for an extended stint? Then I met my partner, and then we moved in together. And then I became a London resident on a more full-time basis. And I still get back to Australia a few months.
Is she English?
Yeah, she's very much English.
The short answer, you did it for love. Right, and that's why I'm in the northeast. That's why I'm in the northeast of England. It's for love, right?
That's a much better answer than what I said.
Now I'll come back to the cricket piece, but let's kind of just focus on the political piece. So you've I know that you worked for, some Australian prime ministers. You've been in politics, so kind of take us through that journey. What was it like?
Yeah, it was pretty full on. And that's an understatement. It was extremely intense. I was a creature of the Labor Party from age 18. I got first involved in sort of, as you do at university, joined the Labor Party. And I think I'd actually joined in high school, like when I was living in the United States. When I was 17, I was an exchange student for 12 months, which is an unusual thing to do when you're 17, to be away for a year. But I was, and it happened to correspond with the time that America was turned upside down by the September 11 attacks. And I joined the Labor Party in that period. And upon returning home, I just really wanted to be involved in contributing to making the world a better place. It sounds ridiculously idealistic. And we know that politics isn't, strictly speaking, that as much as we would like it to be. But that was my avenue into it. I had strong views. I had a sense of social justice. I studied it hard at school. I was going to study it at university. And I thought that it was a potential career path for me. And I just went at it like bullet agape stuff, really. And within a year or so, I was working for my local member of parliament, one of my local members of parliament. Then a few years after that, I was running sort of the Young Labor operation. And a year after that, I was working for the Prime Minister, which is a very odd transition, but there was an election in 2007. Labor was in power for the first time for 11 and a half years. I was very, very fortunate to get an opportunity working on the 2007 election campaign as a very junior media operative. I was 23. I had to collect the newspapers off the truck at 3:30 every morning, and that job continued into government. It was a fraction later. I was getting the papers at 5 to 4 off the back of a truck. I'd take them into the PM's office. I'd scour them with a highlighter. And then at 5:15 each morning, there'd be a briefing with most of the heavy hitters, and I would brief them on the news of the day as they were waking up for their workday. And that was kind of the start of my life working in full-on politics. And after that, I suppose I did relatively well in that setting and enjoyed that setting a lot. Enjoyed giving my everything to it, and maybe in hindsight that was a mistake, giving absolutely everything to a job, but at the time it didn't feel that way. It felt like the right thing to do. And within a year or so, I got promoted to a more senior role in the PM's office as a political advisor, and working on some broader communication stuff, which was really exciting. And the year after that, I was, I guess, my biggest of breaks, which was the deputy, well, it was the treasurer then, the federal treasurer, Wayne Swanee, became the deputy prime minister not long after that. He was hiring for a press secretary, and we knew each other because I'd been invited to serve in the parliamentary tactics committee, or the question time tactics committee, as like the young whippersnapper, and Swanee asked me to come and work for him. And so at age 25, I was the press secretary to the treasurer, and he became deputy prime minister not long after that. I had a senior colleague I was working with, but it was still a pretty big gig at a young age, and that's what I did for the next few years. There were a few different twists and turns along the way. I spent a year in the UK actually on sabbatical, working on the Olympic Games in 2012, when I needed to get away from the whole thing for a while, when I did burn out, and took a year off. But I came back to it and was the deputy communications director on the 2013 national campaign. And then gracefully departed stage left at age 29, and said that was it for me. I'd done my decade as a political staffer, and I would go on and do other things.
What was it like to be at the centre of power? What was the best and worst part of it?
I think for me, it was observing being in the centre of power. I mean, I was there. I was a participant, but I wasn't a principal. I didn't have MP next to my name. I wasn't a minister. I wasn't a chief of staff either. I was a functionary around the big decisions being made. So getting to observe the behaviour of senior decision makers is fascinating. Getting to help inform those decisions is enthralling, exhilarating. Not to say that my advice was the advice always taken, but when it was, I mean, that's a pretty big deal for someone who's relatively young, and whether I was ready for that or not is neither here nor there. I was trusted with that responsibility at the time to give that sort of advice, and to brief the press gallery, or press lobby as you call it over here, each day, and go up there and be speaking on behalf of senior people. It was a great experience professionally. I had to grow up very quickly. I had to go from being a fairly fast and loose 23-year-old, albeit with ambition and interest, and I guess a pretty good academic backing, but still I was pretty fast and loose. And by the end of that time, you had to grow up. You had to sit at the big kids table. And I found that idea of observing people who have to make big decisions the most captivating part of the entire job, and hopefully something that has been positive for me now running my own business essentially, and knowing that I guess in some ways knowing the wrong way to do things, but also having good role models in that same way.
And what did you hate about it? What was the worst part of it? What was, we both know politicians very well, right?
Yeah.
So I can almost guess some of the answers, but what would be the worst part of it?
I mean, the toxicity, the cultural toxicity of politics, especially at the top level. Yeah. And maybe it's one of those things where it's actually not as bad at the top level as it is at the lower levels. I can't remember anymore, frankly, but I do know that whilst there was a cult-like loyalty to each other, and that remains to this day, incidentally, the people I worked with through that era, I mean, I feel I love them deeply and would do anything for them. Deeply love them. And I think they feel the same way about me. And it's not as though we all always got on. We'd have steaming rows on a daily basis. Even the Deputy Prime Minister, the Wayne in question, I mean, I wrote his book after he finished, I wrote a significant slab of his book when he finished as Deputy PM. And even then we continue to have these blazing rows, but he'd do anything for me and I'd do anything for him. And I think that loyalty is the best fit. But on the other side of it is that the tribalism and the nature of tribal politics is such that you would do anything to diminish and hurt other people. And I think that, and I've said this before, I think that your moral radar when you work in professional politics gets skewed on a personal level. So you're taught and you're conditioned to not just, and this is a crossover with some work you've done with the Australian cricket team, but not just push up against the line, but your job is to push over the line and cheat and break the rules just a little bit, but not get caught. Break the rules to your advantage every day and not get caught. And I think that the saddest part for me is that bled into my personal life. So when I finished up, I was asked to write a letter to myself, to my 17-year-old self. A pop culture website asked me to do this a few years ago, and I might have been out of politics for 2 years by then or something like that. And that was a big period of introspection for me. And I remember at the time thinking that I really regret the way my personal relationships reflected my professional need to be conniving. And I think that was a time in my life when I wouldn't have treated people particularly well, and they wouldn't have treated me particularly well on the flip side of that. And it took me a long time and frankly, a lot of therapy to realize how I had these, the connections in my brain weren't as good as they should have been, or as robust as they should have been when I needed them to be to help with my moral judgments at the time.
I get that, and politics is, I know it's a fascinating subject for you and a fascinating subject for me, but I'll just kind of not dwell too much on it. So let's just kind of flip over to the cricket side, right?
Sure.
Because I know you've been on the losing side to me on a couple of occasions. So I just talk about some of the cricket events. What would be your best moment in cricket? What's the kind of moment you look back and say, wow, that was just fantastic. I was there.
It's funny. It could have been a year yesterday. So we're recording this on the 15th of July. The 14th of July last year was the World Cup final at Lord's. And for me, it was the culmination of a lot of things. So a year earlier, 9 months earlier, in the desert of Dubai and the UAE, I had a pretty remarkable experience where I was going to say good fortune. That's the wrong formulation of words. I had the pride of buying the international broadcast rights for the Australian-Pakistan Test series. I say pride because it was bloody hard work, and it was a massive personal financial risk and reputational risk, and we pulled it off, and it was a raging success, and it was written about around the world, and there's been a documentary made about it on radio by the ABC last year, and it's been, it's probably something that people will talk about for me forever, like in cricket terms. They'll remember me as that guy that did that thing. Anyway, press fast forward to the World Cup last year, and there was a situation where, and I won't bore you with all the detail here, but the world feed wasn't functioning the way that it should be to broadcast back to the 17 radio stations around the world who needed it. And a radio station I'd worked for came to me and said, "Can you fix this for us?" And I said, I can do this. I want to do this, and I can do this. And I was able to assemble an international caliber broadcast team for the last 6 games of the World Cup, of course, culminating in the unbelievable final, which culminated in a super over. And to be on the microphone myself for that last 5 overs of regulation and in the entirety of the super over, and having done, I think a pretty good job with it. I'm proud of the job I did in calling that moment. For me, it wasn't just a culmination of a day's work. It was in some respects 4 or 5 years of being involved in broadcasting, a lot of it in alternative broadcasting and pirate radio. It's how we got our start on the air, and having that that come to fruition, I guess, in that one moment, that one ball at Lords. And I listen back to it from time to time. It gets played from time to time when I've done various different projects. And it always gives me a shiver down the spine to know that when the time was there, I kind of nailed it. And that was exhilarating.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And what would be your worst moments in cricket?
My worst moment in cricket is going to take some thinking, because I've had a really great experience. I think my worst moment is more like it's when you're rejected. It's when, for me, I suppose my pride can be dinted when things don't go the way I want them to. When I don't get to do the things I'd like to do, and so on. So it's not as though there's one example of my worst moment, but that's when I'm at my lowest ebb. And I suppose the saddest time in cricket really was the time when I was in South Africa covering the ball tampering saga. I was on air commentating when Cameron got pinged by the officials, and I was in the press conference with Steve and Cameron that night, and I was hanging around the hotel watching Davey the next day, or the days after the test match had finished. And I was on air when the test match finished, in fact, the next day. I remember this as well because I was calling with Adam Voges, a former test player who Cameron considers a mentor and a very close friend. He's former captain in the WA side.
And this is Cameron Bancroft, the Australian cricketer, obviously.
Cameron Bancroft, the Australian cricketer, yeah, who I know you've had a lot to do with. Adam
don't make that association. I've had a lot to do with subsequently, not in the particular instance.
Subsequently, indeed, helping him get back on the right track. But I remember calling the finale of that test match and being extremely emotional, not like crying, but the way I called the end of that, I think it said something like, suffering the humiliation his team deeply, deeply deserve, or something like that. It was a variation of that formulation of words or whatever. I'm gibbering here, but I basically was getting at the point that Australia had earned this team had earned this humiliation, and I wanted to make that really clear. And I think that I got perhaps carried away a bit in that moment, but that's because it was just so sad for them. It was just so sad how it all played out, knowing how their lives were going to be so dramatically affected. When the press conference took place in behind the press box at Cape Town there, I said to my colleagues, he's fucked. He's gone. Steve is gone. That's it. He's going to be sacked. And my colleagues were saying, some of them were saying, oh, come on, mate. It's just a bit of ball, just a ball tampering charge. Like he'll get in trouble and he'll, and I go, no. And I just knew, my political instincts kicked in. I knew he was in an enormous amount of trouble. I knew he was lying. I didn't know how, but I knew he was lying, one, and I knew that he was in enormous amount of trouble. My radar, it ticked off. And that was sad too. I mean, I'd interviewed Steve a number of times and had a strong regard for him as a bloke and as a nice guy and a well-meaning guy. And here he was about to walk into an utter shitstorm, and I knew it. And that was sad. But at the same time, I knew that they deserved what was coming on a different level, on a cricketing level. They deserved what was coming, and the full story came out in the fullness of time. But yeah, that was a chastening time.
Okay, it was. I obviously have very vivid memories of being in that hotel, and in similar ways to you, looking at it with different lens, obviously, and different perspective and different feelings of how to protect or to recalibrate some of the stuff that was going on. But, that was cricket. So who's the cricketer you admire most? Who's looking back? Who would be the sporting hero and why?
That's a great question. Who's the cricketer I admire most? It's hard because I suppose in some respects the old adage of never meeting your heroes does ring true when it comes to players I grew up watching, frankly. And that's fine. That's just the circle of going from being a kid to being an adult, that you realise that people aren't necessarily what you built them up to be. I'm sure it's the same with other mentors, not just sports people. But I think that as far as who I idolized as a kid, that was more for their sport. It was more for how graceful they were as cricketers. So Mark Waugh, Shane Warne, it's quite a common answer, I suppose, for a guy of my age to have idolized them as players. But who now I think of in those terms is a slightly harder question to answer. I have a huge amount of regard for a lot of cricketers, which perhaps is why I'm finding it hard to answer your question. It's hard to just nominate one person, I think, as someone I hold in that esteem above anyone else. I'll give you an example of someone I really do admire greatly, though, Jason Gillespie. Jason Gillespie was an exceptional cricketer who I loved watching bowl, but I also really admire the way that he, much like Ian Chappell, actually, who's another person I deeply admire, he has no hesitation in going out there and telling the world what he thinks, even when inside the cricket bubble, it wouldn't always be considered to be de rigueur. So take, for example, the fact that he's a vegan, which isn't really a thing that cricketers do, really, not often, or certainly not historically, having come out of that tradition of the Australian cricket team. Or his environmental activism is another thing I admire, or the way that he talks about his Indigenous background. He was the first Aboriginal to play for Australia, of course. So someone like Jason, I think, is an outstanding human being, and he was an outstanding cricketer. And having got to know him professionally and having had him on various shows that I've done, the esteem I hold him in only grows and grows. And in recent times, just last week indeed, I've worked with Michael Holding, and I'm good friends with Ebony Rainford-Brent, but the way that they spoke last week in the context of Black Lives Matter, it was
powerful, absolutely powerful.
Very special, wasn't it? It was an incredible, way to, it was an incredible way to see the whole thing encapsulated in the space of 10 minutes of television. And don't get me wrong, there are other people out there who fought this fight and who have been right at the middle of all of this, but that it was on Sky, I think, was telling. It was like, on a Murdoch product, that they just gave them the space, that a lot of Sky subscribers would hate them for running this topic at the top of their cricket program. And yet they did it anyway. And it was so admirable. And Ebony, on a personal level, having seen the way in which she is just taken to this and made it her mission to be vocal and present for other people. I mentioned on my show yesterday, that must be so draining. Imagine how draining it must be, getting up on top of all the things we have to do in our lives to, make a living, to live a productive life professionally, to care for the people that you love, to be there as someone who supports others. And then on top of all of that, go, right, I'm going to go out there every single day and advocate on behalf of an entire race of people. That is grueling. But there's Ebony every single day doing her thing. She's a wonderful woman.
Yeah, she is. I've had the pleasure of meeting with her, and I did a podcast with her as well.
Yes.
And, she's lovely. She's funny. She's witty, talented, obviously. And, she talks to a topic that's very close to me, because I've got 3 black grandchildren. And, I'm kind of, want a world where, talent is recognized rather than anything else. But anyway, different story. So I'm conscious of the time. We could talk forever. So, part of what I'm doing and what I've been involved in is, as you know, is about mindset. So, where do you stand on the topic of mindset? And, as a broadcaster, as a, commentator, as a person who's worked at the highest levels of politics, what would you say to people about mindset, especially now when we're facing all of the challenges that we're facing in the world today?
Yeah. Okay. So I reckon that it took me a long time to work out some really important and basic life lessons when it comes to mindset. I think that I was always predisposed to suffering from anxiety. I think that I was always built that way. Like I'm a control freak, or have been a control freak historically. you could argue perfectionist might be the wrong word, but I've become quite obsessive when I'm working or whatever I'm involved in, really. And for the most part, I think that's a good thing, or a productive thing at least. But I realised over time that it was holding me back a bit, especially when it came to living in the present moment. I think that I spent so much time fixated on the past, what I could have done better, and consumed with the future about what I might do, that I found it hard to enjoy and respect and appreciate what was happening in the here and now. And a number of failed relationships probably spell that out, frankly. But I think the big turning point of all of that was getting out of politics and having a chance to just kind of unpack a lot of times when I made a lot of bad decisions and sort of understand, take responsibility for it. For my mindset, that is. So take responsibility for knowing that it was up to me to be the best version of myself that I could be. And I said this recently to my therapist, actually, perhaps 6 months ago or so, that the reason I was there was to be the best version of myself that I could be, and in turn, the best father I could be before Winnie was born. And that requires constant maintenance. It doesn't come because you want it. It comes because you put the work in, you get out what you put in. Cliched as that sounds, that's how I feel about it when it comes to mindset for me, and being able to practice mindfulness to that extent. So I know that when I'm meditating regularly, and when I'm journaling regularly, and when I'm practicing yoga regularly, that I am a better person to be around. Yeah. I know that when I'm not, I'm harder work, and that can't be a coincidence. It's because you're training your brain, the neural pathways and all the rest of it, stuff I've learned. Which I never thought about before. I just thought that that's just the way I am. That's how I present, as a full-on sort of, workaholic and obsessive type. Well, that's just the way I'm always going to be. So there's no point, sort of dwelling on that. Let's make the most of the situation. When instead I realized that there is a way that you can step back from all of this, and you can have a more productive relationship with people around you while not giving up any of your other advantages.
Yeah. And I say often, if you can't afford 10 minutes a day for meditation, then you need to spend an hour on it. That's kind of one of the general observations, but that's just fantastic, and we could talk forever, but I know that you do the podcast, The Final Word. Where can people find that?
The Final Word, finalwordcricket.com is our website, and it contains, everything really, but mostly, the podcast we've been doing there for 5.5 years, and the Calling the Shots mini-series, which has been the documentary I made recently, is also on there, which is a sort of a history of cricket commentary. So that's all inside that finalwordcricket.com website.
And it is fantastic, and I would recommend to people to take the opportunity of listening in, because it gives you some good insights on what's actually happening. So what's next for you before we finish up? So where are you going? More cricketing, more broadcasting? What's next for you?
Yeah, I hope so. I think of it as entrepreneurship as well. Like that story I told you about buying the rights to that series, that was pretty exciting. And I think I need that kind of stimulation. I need to be doing something that's new all the time. I mean, longer term, I've never been shy about the fact that I'm interested in public life. I mean, it's kind of everybody knows that. There's no point in me being shy about that. I've always been interested in politics. And I think in the future, if when the time's right and when I'm ready for it, that's something I'm certainly interested in going back into. But for now,
here in the UK or in Australia?
I think in reality it'd be Australia, but let's see how things go. But I think that for the time being, I really enjoy developing. How I thought of it was that I spent my 20s in politics. I'm spending my 30s in the creative industries, and we'll see where I'm at for my 40s. I'm 35 now, so I'm halfway through this decade, and let's see what I do in my 40s. But I certainly love this journey that I'm on at the moment in cricket, and I love the fact that it's one that I can now share with my family, and because cricket is special. There's something about the rhythms of the game. There's something about the long pauses. There's something about the consideration over days that I think is special and unique and beautiful. And I want to make sure that my daughter gets to be involved in that with me as well. So even if I do go and move on and do other things professionally, cricket will always be close to me.
Oh, listen, thanks very much for the time. It's just, as always, riveting, interesting. Your enthusiasm, your passion, your commitment kind of comes across so clearly. I've had the pleasure of meeting you, and I've even had a drink with you, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
Yeah, we've done that. We must do that again.
Do it again soon. Yes.
And I can tell you, on the fact of an Irish person talking to an Australian about cricket, when somebody who has no idea about the game at all, and who's constantly trying to learn it, was fantastic. But yes, thank you for your time. I really
thank you, Horace. You're a good man. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.